All right, on this slide, I'm going to identify some of the components that have to do with CSF flow and the CSF movement through the ventricles. So you should be able to identify the lateral ventricles on all of these segments. So within this area here, within this area here, and also within this area here. So be able to identify the lateral ventricle on any cut. I can tag it on any single cut. I do also want you to notice on this axial section here, this substance within the lateral ventricle here, I could tag this and I could ask for this structure. This is the choroid plexus. This is the structure responsible for generating the cerebrospinal fluid. So if I ask for the space, I'm asking for the ventricle, the lateral ventricle. If I'm asking for the structure, I'm asking for the choroid plexus. Next, you should be able to identify the third ventricle. So if I put a tag anywhere in this area here, or a tag anywhere in this area here, okay, I'm going to make it very specific. That's the third ventricle. You should also be able to identify the cerebral aqueduct. So the cerebral aqueduct traverses between the tectum and the tegmentum. So again, here, I'm going to change this color here to orange. Tectum, the roof, and the tegmentum, the base of the midbrain. The cerebral aqueduct is traversing through these two. The cerebral aqueduct is taking the cerebral spinal fluid from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. So again, there's a cerebral aqueduct, and here's a nice cerebral aqueduct too. Taking the CSF from the third ventricle into the fourth ventricle. So if I ask for a space here adjacent to the cerebellum, please tell me this is the fourth ventricle. Okay, here I'm going to go over some gross anatomy of the cerebellum, and I'm going to begin by talking about the white matter of the cerebellum. This is all known as the arbor vitae, all of the white matter going through the cerebellum here. All right, that's the arbor vitae. And now I'm going to go over the fissures, and then we're going to talk about what these fissures divide. So this first fissure right here that I'm going over in green, this is the primary fissure. This is going to divide the anterior lobe, which I'm circling in blue. This is the anterior lobe, from the posterior lobe, which is going to be all of this. Okay, that's the primary fissure, dividing the anterior lobe from the posterior lobe. The horizontal fissure is going to divide the posterior lobe into two parts. It's seen better on some other sections, but you can see the horizontal fissure right here. It's dividing the posterior lobe into two parts. And then I'm going to change colors to red. This fissure right here, this is the posterolateral fissure. This is dividing the posterior lobe from the floccular nodular lobe. So right here you can see I'm going to go over here in white, this is actually the nodule right here. If I ask for the particular structure, I want you to tell me nodule. If I ask for the lobe, that's the flocculonodular lobe. Okay. So again, the primary fissure is dividing the anterior and posterior lobes. The horizontal fissure divides the posterior lobes in half, and then the posterior lateral fissure divides the posterior lobe from the floccular nodular lobe. And within the floccular nodular lobe, we have the flocculus and the nodule, but I'm only going to be tagging the nodule on this section right here. Okay, so we don't have a good brain specimen that shows the cerebellar peduncles, but they are important to know, so I'm going to use one of these pictures on the laboratory exam. So A is representing the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Let me go over this. So this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And this is an afferent pathway, and it's connecting the medulla to the cerebellum, and it's also the inferior border of the fourth ventricle. B is the middle cerebellar peduncle. B is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And this is an afferent pathway that connects the cerebellum with the basal pons. And it also forms the lateral border of the fourth ventricle. And then C, the one above, is the superior cerebellar peduncle. So the superior cerebellar peduncle is an efferent pathway from the cerebellum to the red nucleus of the midbrain. And therefore it connects the cerebellum to the midbrain. So please know the locations and please know the general functions and relays of these particular peduncles. Okay, on these pieces, I'm going to be pointing out two more additional structures. So we're going to start with the dentate. So you can see the dentate here. I'm not going to tag the fastigial or the interposed nuclei because they're a little hard to distinguish, and that wouldn't be totally fair. But any of these segments that you can clearly see the dentate, I can definitely tag. The dentate nuclei are the largest of the deep cerebellar cluster of neurons. It has this dentated or serrated edge, hence the name dentate nuclei. The efferent fibers are involved in the modulation of motor neurons and also neurons that are involved in conscious thought and visuospatial function. So it connects the cerebellum, connects the little brain to the big brain essentially, and helps to relay all of those motor functions and conscious thought. And then I also want to point out here the vermis of the cerebellum. So you can see the vermis here. The vermis is the division between the cerebellar hemispheres. You can see it better on a posterior view, but if I tag something right in here, you can tell that's the vermis because that's going to be on the posterior view, the area that separates the cerebellar hemispheres into the left and the right halves.